The scent of polished synth fiber and high-G stabilizer fluid hit Lysander first, a false cleanliness overriding the station's permanent smell of burnt flux and ozone. He didn't look up as Admiral Tyrus's boots, expensive and far too clean, hit the grimy deck plates just 3 feet behind him. He merely whispered, "Shut up." It was a command directed at the raw data console flickering before him, a desperate plea to the universe to stop broadcasting the impossible truth for 30 more seconds, the exact time the Admiral's security detail needed to override the local network lock Lysander had slapped on the system 15 minutes prior. The Crucible relay station was a miserable knot of compressed metal hanging on the edge of the K7 gravity well, designed for function, not comfort. But Tyrus moved through it as if it were a capital ship bridge, his posture radiating the unwarranted confidence of a man whose reality had been carefully curated by layers of command staff and obsolete calculations. Lysander, 55 and looking 70, hunched over the main comms deck, his hands, stained perpetually black from heavy lubricant, hovering over the unauthorized bypass circuit. He was an orbital mechanic who understood physics better than he understood people, and right now physics was screaming betrayal. "Status mechanic," Tyrus clipped, the word mechanic carrying the implied insult of a man who only dealt with dirt and dead matter. Lysander didn't flinch, his eyes glued to the three-dimensional plot. Tyrus was here hunting the Seraph, a rogue destroyer that supposedly defected 5 subjective years ago, carrying secrets too critical to lose. That was the official line broadcast across the Confederacy, but the console in front of Lysander didn't show the Seraph. It showed the catastrophic consequence of the Confederacy's strategic ignorance, the invisible time debt they had racked up in the name of swift, high-relativistic war jumps. 5 years for the fleet, constantly pushing the speed of light, meant nearly 30 objective years had passed back home. 30 years Lysander had consciously left behind. The Seraph was a ghost ship whose crew had likely died of old age or sickness 2 decades prior. Tyrus was chasing a historical footnote, preserved in amber by the laws of space-time, and this realization, this quiet, agonizing truth of relativistic time dilation, was the engine of Lysander's deep and bitter contempt for the system he was meant to serve. He hated the idea that his past life, his family, his original planet, had aged out of his reach while he protected them from threats that no longer existed. "We have a confirmed trajectory lock on the primary target, Admiral." Lysander lied smoothly, not lifting his gaze from the anomaly. The primary target was a joke. The real target, the real threat, was the trace that had been flickering violently just 3 light seconds behind the entire pursuing fleet for the last half hour. The system kept trying to filter it as simple jump shadow debris, the necessary illusion to maintain operational morale and keep the chase plausible. Lysander had stripped the filters down to the molecular noise, and what he saw was undeniable. It was too small to be a ship, certainly not a destroyer. It was too fast to be anything the Confederacy had ever built. Its trajectory correction vectors defied current propulsion models, exhibiting a precision that wasn't reactive but almost preemptive. It was hunting, not traveling. It was adjusting its velocity and course not based on where the fleet was, but where the fleet would be after its next jump vector calculation. Tyrus leaned in, his smell stronger now. Lysander could hear the rustle of the security details approaching footsteps through the deck plates. "Good. Initiate the broadcast," Tyrus commanded. "We need the fleet to synchronize before the next window. Let them know the hunt is almost over." To initiate the broadcast meant cleansing the data, allowing the system to naturally overwrite the anomaly with the official debris signature. This was Lysander's out. He could let the lie persist, save his own skin, and allow the Admiral to sail directly into the unknown predator's mouth. Or he could hit the bypass, forcing the raw, unfiltered return trace onto every primary tactical screen in the fleet, exposing not only the immediate threat, but also the horrifying truth of their temporal debt, the systemic, paralyzing fact that the Confederacy had wasted 30 years protecting a memory. Lysander felt the cold plastic of the manual override beneath his thumb, the small button a brutal choice pressed into his palm. treason, or mass casualty. He remembered the look on his daughter's face. Years ago, 30 years ago, when she was a small child, the last time he had promised her he would be back soon. Soon, in relativistic time, had become a lifetime. He had sold his objective time for a subjective illusion of duty. The guilt, a stone that never moved from his gut, manifested as a sudden, sharp tremor in his right hand. He needed that hand steady. The simple human error, the physical consequence of his past failure, cost him a critical half-second. "Mechanic," I said. "Now," Tyrus insisted, his tone hardening. Lysander swallowed, the metallic taste rising in his throat. He saw the trace, the needle of fate, jerk violently, accelerating again. It sensed the fleet's impending jump, a silent, ravenous calculation. If he revealed the trace, the fleet would have to abort the jump, delaying their pursuit. They would be stationary, exposed, but alive. The temporal debt would be exposed, shattering the morale and the command structure of the Confederacy. It would prove the whole war, the whole sacrifice, had been built on a decades-old lie. He knew what they would call him: traitor, system destabilizer. But he also knew what the cold, indifferent data showed. The anomaly was not interested in the Seraph. It was interested in the fleet itself. "Admiral," Lysander said, his voice a low rasp that fought against the hiss of the recycled atmosphere. "I advise immediate—" "I don't need your advice. I need your compliance," Tyrus cut in, placing a heavy, gloved hand on Lysander's shoulder. The weight of command, the weight of ignorance, was physical. "We follow protocol, Mechanic. We secure the objective and maintain the operational timeline. You understand morale is critical, yes?" Lysander understood morale. Morale was the collective soothing lie that kept the system running. "The time lag, Admiral," Lysander tried, pushing the single truth that might penetrate the officer's thick skull. "The objective time," Tyrus scoffed, pulling his hand back. "Relativistic mathematics are above your pay grade, Lysander. We account for variance. 5 years is 5 years. Now finalize the transmission." The security override chime rang softly from the far side of the console. Lysander had run out of time. His unauthorized lock was broken. Tyrus's control was reasserting itself. He had maybe 3 seconds before the system automatically scrubbed the anomalous data and broadcast the clean, safe lie to the fleet. The choice was taken from him. Lysander's trembling hand slammed down on the override button, not to cleanse the data, but to perform the forced bypass. It was a hard-wired, analog circuit he had installed himself 2 weeks earlier, a ghost in the machine designed only for this scenario. A raw, shrieking electrical surge tore through the comms deck, the kind of overload that tasted like burnt hair and galvanized steel. Lights dimmed, then flared violently to a blinding white. Tyrus staggered back, momentarily blinded by the sudden surge of unfiltered energy. "What in the hell, Mechanic?" Tyrus yelled, rubbing his eyes, the veneer of unwarranted confidence finally cracking. Lysander didn't answer. He watched the main tactical screen, which was now filled with jagged, non-compliant data. The system was fighting him, desperately trying to reassert the authorized filters, but the bypass held for a crucial moment. And in that moment, the entire Confederacy fleet, led by the flagship Ironclad, had their navigational screens hijacked. The raw trace, the needle behind them, appeared on every bridge, unfiltered, unexplained, terrifyingly real. It was not debris. It was moving at .987 light speed, a rate that should have torn any conventional vessel apart, yet its trajectory was smooth, predatory, perfect. On the local screen, the Admiral's face, pale and furious, swam into view. "You've destabilized the whole system. You've shown them unverified noise." Lysander leaned in close to the console mic, his voice finally steady, tired, but definitive. "That's not noise, Admiral," Lysander whispered, watching the trace jerk one last time, an almost sentient correction. "That is the consequence of 25 years of ignorance catching up to us, and it just saw us stop." Just as the screen went black, taken down by the system's final, desperate self-correction, a single, Sharp line of text flashed across Lysander's private auxiliary monitor, pulled directly from the anomaly's unique gravitational distortion signature. The system hadn't recognized it, but Lysander did. It wasn't propulsion. It was a mass displacement vector. The object behind them was not generating thrust. It was moving by locally warping spacetime. The mechanical spider on the edge of the gravity well shivered, a sympathetic tremor running through the deck plates as the Admiral's security detail finally reached Lysander. Before they grabbed him, before Tyrus could bark the order for his execution, Lysander registered the final, sickening detail on the auxiliary trace. The unknown thing was slowing down, not to attack, but to match the now stationary fleet's inertia. It was preparing to engage patiently. Lysander looked up at Tyrus, whose face was a mask of cold fury and dawning realization. The Admiral didn't understand the physics yet, but he understood betrayal and imminent threat. "That anomaly you just broadcast," Tyrus snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me what it is, or I'll have you vented." The smell of burnt flux filled Lysander's nostrils again. He felt the heavy grip of the security officer on his arm. He didn't struggle. He simply offered the single, terrifying word that the ancient, unfiltered radar had finally spat out: harvest. The damage was already done when Admiral Tyrus finally understood the consequence of the word Lysander had spoken. The security detail, two identically uniformed enforcers smelling of stale ozone and weapon grease, slammed Lysander against a reinforced comms panel. The synthetic cable restraints dug into the soft flesh of his wrists, a physical consequence of his act of rebellion. The pain was dull, insistent, a minor static against the shrieking, fundamental reality of the harvest signal now swimming across the blacked-out screens. Tyrus stood inches away, no longer arrogant, but dangerously contained. The surge of unfiltered energy had knocked the polished veneer off the Admiral, leaving exposed the desperate core of a man terrified of losing control. "You have destabilized the operational capability of the entire strike force," Tyrus hissed, his breath hot and synthetic against Lysander's ear. 30,000 souls floating in a gravity well, waiting for a synchronization signal that won't come. You gave them a single, unidentified word, mechanic. You have 10 seconds to justify treason. What is a harvest? Lysander adjusted his weight, testing the resilience of the synth cables. They held fast. He focused on the residual smell of burnt circuit boards, a comfortingly honest smell. "It's not a designation, Admiral, it's a function," Lysander said, his voice scraped raw. "Look at the core telemetry, the auxiliary trace before it burned out. It wasn't propulsion we saw, it was a localized warp. The object is collapsing spacetime ahead of itself to move. Non-entropic. Zero waste. And it slowed down when we stopped." Tyrus slapped the scorched metal panel beside Lysander's head. The sound was flat and sharp in the sudden, deep silence of the crucible. "Why? Why did it slow down?" "Because it's hunting, Admiral. It saw the fleet abort the jump. It watched us freeze, exposed by the temporal debt we created. Every high-G jump we make, every relativistic sprint away from the core systems, we throw off a massive, highly specific gravitational signature. Debris, heat, time shadows. We have been leaving a trail of breadcrumbs across 30 years of objective space, and the harvest is designed to feed on that trail." The thought of those 30 wasted years twisted the invisible restraints around Lysander's chest tighter than the synthetic cables. He could still feel the faint, phantom impression of his daughter's small hand in his, the day he promised he'd only be gone a subjective year. The memory was as sharp and painful as the knowledge that he had doomed himself for a fleet that served a lie. This self-inflicted guilt, the memory of a life he voluntarily sacrificed, was why he struck out now. Not for heroism, but to make the 30 years mean something other than an empty promise. "You're talking gibberish," Tyrus spat, stepping back, retrieving his composure by clinging to protocol. "This is a destroyer, a specialized drone, or an experimental craft. It follows established principles. We will launch standard reconnaissance probes, confirm classification, and initiate a full-power jump on my command." Lysander shook his head, a single, decisive movement. "That will kill us all. It will sense the charge signature building up for the jump. It's too close. 2 light seconds now. We are inside its reaction window. Then what is your recommendation, mechanic? Tyrus challenged, sarcasm biting hard. Stare at it until it decides to visit? Lysander didn't answer immediately. He looked past Tyrus to the far console, the unit he had rigged 2 weeks ago. The forced bypass had overloaded the main power conduit, but the auxiliary unit, designed for emergency backup, was still running on minimal battery reserves, feeding a slow drip of unfiltered data into a small, isolated buffer. I need to reroute primary power, Admiral. Not to the comms, that's fried, but to the gravitational sensor array, Lysander proposed, his mind already calculating the power draw. If we feed it raw energy, we might get a high-resolution image of the displacement vector. We need to see how it warps space. Only then can we calculate a countermove, something smaller, quieter, that won't give away our intentions. Tyrus hesitated, his eyes narrowing, weighing the risk of letting the traitor touch the systems again against the risk of the unknown threat. The Admiral understood politics. He did not understand physics. This was Lysander's arena. Fine. You will work under watch. If you touch anything but the power controls, you are vented without appeal. Now move. Tyrus nodded curtly to the security detail. As the restraints were loosened, Lysander felt the shift. Tyrus had transitioned from judge to desperate client. The mechanic was now the most vital man in the room, albeit still a prisoner. Lysander knelt beside the scorched access panel. The heat radiating off the metal was significant, smelling of burnt polymer and potential failure. His hands, though trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash, moved with the precision born of decades spent fixing obsolete, unloved machinery. He stripped the shielding off the power conduits. While connecting the heavy gauge wire to the backup battery, he noticed a correlation on the minimal data feed. The harvest wasn't moving in a straight line relative to the gravity well. Its trajectory was adjusting to the density of the fleet formation. It wasn't targeting the flagship. It was targeting the concentrated mass. Admiral, Lysander said, not looking up, we need to break formation immediately. Disperse. It's not hunting a ship, it's hunting a gravity signature. Tyrus sneered. We break formation. We become scattered targets. Protocol dictates cohesion. Lysander gripped the wire, cutting his thumb slightly. He ignored the blood. Protocol is built on obsolete propulsion models, sir. This thing moves by warping space. If we remain centralized, it sees us as a single, large, tempting distortion. We need to scatter the mass, make the target ambiguous. Impossible. Dispersing the fleet requires minutes of complex data transfer and fuel calculations. We are stationary, Lysander. We have no time for minutes. It was a stalemate born of ignorance in physics. Lysander saw the truth. Tyrus's adherence to the system was the greatest threat. Lysander needed to bypass not just the filters but the command structure itself. He finished the power connection, forcing the auxiliary current into the grav sensor array. The sensor whined, overloading instantly, but not before delivering a single sharp burst of data into the small buffer. Lysander scrambled to read the complex, three-dimensional plot of the displacement field. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The trace wasn't just collapsing space. It was oscillating, creating a localized field around itself that was phasing through standard matter density. It's not conventional weaponry, Admiral, Lysander whispered, his voice catching. The harvest isn't a ship, it's a penetration tool. It's creating a bubble of near-zero density around its core. It's not going to shoot us, it's going to walk through the hull. Tyrus took a step forward, his boot scuffing the deck. Impossible. Shields are active. No matter what exotic propulsion it uses, it must generate some signature we can track. It does, Lysander countered, pointing a greasy finger at the buffer readout. Look at the localized frequency. It's not using power, it's using the residual time dilation energy, the 30 years we wasted, to fuel the oscillation. It's a parasitic technology. And its goal is not destruction, it's sampling. Before Tyrus could respond, the local comm system, which had been silent since the overload, crackled back to life. It was not a synchronization signal. It was a proximity alert, a shrieking metallic whine that cut through the station's recycled air. Code read hull integrity breach, Crucible Station. The station shivered violently around them, a tremor unlike the sympathetic vibration Lysander had felt earlier. This was structural stress. The metal groan was palpable, loud enough to drown out the emergency siren. Tyrus drew his sidearm, a gesture of pathetic, obsolete defense against a thing that warped the fundamental fabric of reality. Where is the breach? Lysander, ignoring the weapon, looked at the remaining security detail, who had frozen. Weapons raised uselessly at the closed metal walls. He knew they couldn't possibly be on the exterior hull. The distance was too vast, the closing speed, even at near light velocity, too long. It's not the hull, Admiral, it's the field generator, Lysander realized, scrambling towards the far end of the console, the section governing the station's minimal gravity well stability. It's stabilizing its trajectory by anchoring itself to our own energy signature. It's using us as a fixed point. He fumbled for the access lock, but the system, sensing the critical breach, had already clamped down. He needed an override code, the master key held by the Admiral. Give me the code, Tyrus. I can dump the reactor feed, cut the anchor point, Lysander yelled, desperation finally overriding caution. Tyrus held the pistol steady, the cold metal reflecting the emergency lights. You will not access the core reactor. You will wait for external assistance. Confederacy procedure. The station screamed again, a high-pitched tearing sound, followed by the sickening smell of superheated lubricant and ionized air. Then silence. The emergency lights died completely, plunging the comms deck into absolute darkness, broken only by the dim, furious red glow of Tyrus's sidearm safety indicator. A single metallic clink echoed from the ventilation shaft directly above them. It was a sound too small, too close, and terrifyingly deliberate. It was the sound of something heavy that had breached the secondary filter grid and was now preparing to drop. The code Lysander needed was useless if they were dead. The harvest was inside. Clink, clink. The descent was measured, mechanical. Lysander felt a wet, cold spray of liquid hitting his neck. Not blood. Lubricant. He reached blindly for the emergency circuit breaker, severing the heavy gauge wire he had just connected. The gravitational sensor array went dead instantly, but not before the auxiliary screen, running on residual capacitor charge, flashed one last horrifying image. A highly focused, perfectly cylindrical shadow projected onto the station's interior bulkhead, its form defined not by light, but by the absence of local spacetime. The mechanical shape paused directly over the shaft opening. Tyrus fired his pistol 3 times into the darkness, the muzzle flashes blinding and futile. The shots were absorbed into the field of non-density, vanishing without sound or impact. Then, the shape dropped. Lysander heard the heavy, sickening thud of massive non-conventional density hitting the deck plates, followed by a sound that made his stomach turn. The sound of synth fiber ripping and a choked wet gasp from one of the security officers. The residual image on Lysander's capacitor screen sharpened, revealing the horrifying scale of the intrusion. The harvest wasn't just a tool, it was a biological collector, a massive, jointed entity using space-time manipulation to bypass matter. And it wasn't after data, it was after biomass. The capacitor charge died. Darkness returned. Lysander felt a profound, cold certainty. The system he served had not only lied to them for 30 years, it had delivered them directly to the slaughter. He scrambled away from the sound of wet, tearing metal in muted struggle. He knew he had maybe 5 seconds before the creature located the heat signature of the Admiral. He took a sharp left, crawling toward the maintenance crawlspace, praying the creature's massive size meant it would ignore the small, insignificant mechanic. But as he reached the narrow access hatch, a new sound began, a high-frequency, complex clicking, almost like rapid-fire Morse code, emanating from the central area where Tyrus had been standing. It wasn't a warning. It was a communication directed outward. The harvest wasn't alone, and by breaching the crucible, It had just activated a silent beacon, signaling its companions. The entire fleet wasn't the target. The crucible was merely the bait. Lysander slammed the maintenance hatch and locked it, the metallic click far too loud in the sudden silence of the station. He pulled himself into the cramped, dark space, the sickening realization hitting him hard. The fleet's 30-year debt had finally paid out, and the interest was about to arrive. The metallic clink-clink of the harvest entity's measured descent had been replaced by the high-frequency, complex clicking, a triumphant Morse code broadcasting outward, before Lysander could finish sealing the maintenance hatch. He didn't waste time on the small lock. He rammed the manual override, twisting the heavy steel pin until his wrists screamed in protest, sealing himself into the claustrophobic darkness of the subdeck utilities crawlspace. The space smelled of stale ozone, heavy lubricant, and his own cold sweat. His immediate goal was isolation. The creature's broadcast had confirmed the station was bait, and Lysander had inadvertently drawn the thing closer by stopping the fleet. He scrambled deeper into the tunnels, ignoring the way the rough edges of the conduits tore at his synth fiber jumpsuit. He needed to find a physical barrier robust enough to block the creature's localized space-time warp field. He remembered the structural integrity schematics. The only place guaranteed to stop exotic phase penetration was the reinforced shielding around the old fusion waste converter, a zone rarely accessed since the crucible was only a temporary relay. He clawed his way forward, pulling himself over rusted junction boxes. He could still hear the clicks, muffled now, but vibrating through the thick deck plating above. It was a rhythmic pulsing sound, like a predatory sonar. Lysander reached the first local pressure seal actuator. This was his chance to buy time, perhaps enough to stop the outward broadcast. He yanked the cover off the control panel, his fingers, stained black and trembling from exhaustion, flying over the archaic circuit board. He bypassed the digital lock and forced the solenoid switch to activate. The mechanical groan of the massive pressure door attempting to cycle was loud, deafening in the enclosed space. It moved maybe 10 centimeters, then stopped abruptly, grinding against something immense. Lysander knew instantly. The harvest entity was too large. Its massive, non-conventional density was physically blocking the seal before it could close completely. The failure was instantaneous and costly. The sound of the grinding seal drew the creature's attention away from its external broadcast. The clicking Morse code stopped. Lysander felt a sudden spike of heat radiating from the deck plate directly above, followed by a low, deep vibration, the kind that speaks of immense localized mass focusing on a target. Focusing on him. He shoved himself backwards, scraping his shoulders against the jagged metal. The air around the pressure seal shimmered, and a sickening smell of superheated metal and ozone wafted into the crawlspace, followed by a brief, intense wave of vertigo that made Lysander's gut churn. He tasted copper and bile. This wasn't standard radiation. This was the effect of localized space-time distortion nearby. The harvest was attempting to walk through the barrier. "Damn it," he rasped, his voice catching. He needed a harder stop. The fusion waste converter was still 50 meters away. He reached the end of the maintenance tunnel, a vertical shaft descending to the main engineering sublevel. He had to drop. No time to use the ladder rungs. He took a deep breath of the stale, recycled air and let go. The impact jarred his teeth, the pain shooting up his spine and into his skull. He lay winded on the cold, solid floor of the sublevel, struggling to draw a clean breath. The pain was immediate, but the urgency was greater. He saw a glimmer of light, an emergency power line still sputtering power to a small, localized environmental control unit. He crawled towards the panel, recognizing the antiquated design. This was the system governing the emergency coolant lines. Highly pressurized, highly reactive hydrogen-3 lines ran beneath this section. If he could breach one, the ensuing catastrophic decompression might act as a localized explosive, a desperate, self-destructive defense. He worked frantically, ignoring the persistent metallic taste in his mouth caused by the spatial distortion effects. He stripped the conduit shielding. 2 seconds, maybe 3, he calculated. He slammed his elbow into the valve release. Instead of an explosion, there was a violent shriek of depressurization. Supercooled hydrogen gas erupted into the sublevel, instantly frosting the surrounding bulkheads. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 seconds, replacing the smell of ozone with the sharp, clean scent of cryogenic leakage. The pressure differential was immense, but it was not the tactical defense he'd hoped for. The Harvest was unbothered. The freezing gas didn't deter the entity. It merely slowed its mechanical progress by microseconds. Worse, the explosive decompression had ruptured several older conduit bundles nearby, including a main fiber optic relay running parallel to the wall. Lysander, shivering violently from the cold and the adrenaline, looked up at the damaged line. The exposed fiber optic cable was still flickering, attempting to transmit data. He pressed his grime-covered thumb against the raw ends, forcing a connection. The flickering resolved into jagged lines of data, too chaotic to be useful, except for one persistent, isolated signature that the system kept trying to filter. An external distress beacon. Lysander recognized the frequency. It was not a Confederacy standard, but a specialized high-bandwidth signal used by independent salvage vessels operating near the K7 exclusion zone. The signal was weak, but terrified. Then, Lysander saw the visual trace linked to the distress call, displayed faintly on the damaged line. The salvaged data showed a standard two-dimensional radar plot of the fleet perimeter, and superimposed on that plot was a massive second anomaly. It dwarfed the first Harvest entity. It was huge, nearly the size of a light cruiser, and its trajectory was confirmed. It had just entered the local system and was decelerating to match the stationary fleet's inertia. The Harvest inside the Crucible hadn't just been sending a beacon, it had been signaling the arrival of the main force. The small ship Lysander had encountered was merely the advanced scout, the Collector. The second trace was the Thresher. The chilling, complex clicking sound started again, emanating from the access shaft above him. The creature had located him, and realizing the coolant explosion was merely local noise, it resumed its external communication, broadcasting the coordinates of the now compromised Crucible bait station. Lysander slumped against the frozen bulkhead, his breath clouding in the sudden cold. He had failed to stop the first, smaller threat, and in doing so had exposed the 30,000 souls of the fleet to something far worse. His failures were accumulating, each attempt at rescue only deepening the grave. Then, a sudden, sharp static burst from the emergency comms panel beside him. A separate unit buried deep in the sublevel infrastructure, isolated from the fried comms deck. A familiar voice, ragged and strained, cut through the static, bypassing encryption layers Lysander knew were impossible to crack unless one possessed the master codes. "Mechanic Lysander," Tyrus's voice rasped, layered with pain and fury. "I know you're down there. I saw the flash, the thing. It's processing the rest of the detail. I need an escape route. Now." The Admiral was alive, wounded, and communicating directly to him. Lysander had the access he needed to the fleet's primary channels, but only if he played the role of the Admiral's guide. He had spent 30 years serving the Confederacy's illusion, and now the system, personified by the pathetic shell of Tyrus, was begging for salvation. "Admiral," Lysander whispered into the auxiliary mic, his voice steady despite the cold and the nausea. "The engineering sub-level connects to a maintenance shuttle dock, level 5. Highly shielded. It might still have power. Level 5? That area was decommissioned 5 years ago. It's structurally unsound." Tyrus snarled, fear overriding protocol. "It is also the only place shielded enough to delay that thing, Admiral. You have the access codes for the shuttle's encrypted comms. I need you to lead me there, and I need access to those frequencies. We have a problem bigger than the Harvest on this station." Lysander leveraged his knowledge, making his cooperation conditional. Tyrus hesitated. Lysander could hear the labored breathing, the sound of movement against torn uniform synthetic. The Admiral was bleeding, desperate, but still clinging to the idea of command. "Get me to level 5, mechanic, and you'll get your damn amnesty and a new life on the core worlds. Now give me the primary structural schematics for the fastest route. Lysander had the primary schematics burned into his memory. He knew the fastest route was the engineering core access tunnel, a route that was structurally sound but narrow, forcing Tyrus to move slowly, making him an easy target for the creature. But he also knew the safest route led straight into the primary breach zone. He made the calculation in a cold, brutal instant, a moment of moral self-immolation. He needed Tyrus's comms unit to warn the fleet. Tyrus's life was secondary. Take the north subtunnel, Admiral, Lysander instructed, pointing Tyrus toward the slower, riskier route, away from Lysander's current location. It's narrow, but the shielding is thicker. I'll meet you at the access valve. Tyrus cut the connection, the single word he spoke echoing the Admiral's return to his old clipped self. Compliance. Lysander turned back to the damaged fiber optic line. He forced the raw data to resolve the trace of the second, massive entity again. It was now within reaction range of the stationary fleet. The delay the fleet had bought by aborting the jump was over. He saw the pattern. A slow, deliberate deceleration, mirroring the first harvest. It was preparing to engage, not quickly, but patiently, ensuring maximal efficiency. The 30 years of temporal debt had not only brought a collector to their door, but an entire industrial harvester. Lysander had made his choice. He had compromised his integrity to save the fleet. Now he had to make that sacrifice count. He heard the heavy, sickening thud of the harvest entity hitting the main engineering sub-level floor directly above his position. It was no longer moving with measured steps. It was running. It had found the route the Admiral was taking. Lysander was now entirely alone, in the cold, dark sub-level with the terrifying knowledge that the fleet was 2 minutes from complete annihilation, and his only way to warn them was a wounded, furious man being chased to his execution. Lysander dragged himself away from the immediate cold of the coolant leak, his muscles screaming against the sudden exertion. The path to the fusion waste converter was out. The grinding sound of the harvest entity proving its density was too immense for the seal to cycle. He abandoned the idea of a physical defense. His survival now hinged entirely on the execution of the final, desperate gamble, using Tyrus to gain access to the fleet's primary channels. He needed to buy time to reach level 5, but the massive second trace, the Thresher, was closing. Lysander forced himself to focus on the flickering fiber optic bundle again, the one that had intercepted the external signal. He wasn't looking for a tactical update. He was chasing the source of the anomaly's data encryption. If the harvest was a parasitic technology, it had to be driven by intelligence. He pressed the raw ends of the fiber to a minimal testing port, bypassing the corrupted comms relay entirely. The faint visual trace resolved, not into coordinates, but into a fragmented ship designation. Lysander squinted in the dim emergency light filtering from the sputtering unit. The lettering was archaic, barely recognizable, a pre-Confederacy dialect. The Ethel Covenant. A wave of cold, comprehensive understanding washed over him, a greater chill than the cryogenic gas. The Ethel Covenant was not an invasion force. It was a phantom faction, a political movement exiled 50 years ago, objective time, when the Confederacy decided to prioritize rapid expansion over sustainable resource management. They had been written out of history, deemed extinct. Lysander knew their symbol from obsolete engineering logs, an Ouroboros, the coiled serpent consuming its own tail, symbolizing cyclic time. The harvest was not alien. It was the system turning on itself. The Ethel Covenant had simply mastered the laws of physics the Confederacy chose to ignore, weaponizing the 30 years of temporal debt. They weren't seeking destruction. They were seeking repossession. The fleet wasn't a target of war. It was collateral for an overdue financial failure. Lysander felt a sickening surge of realization. His 5 years of service, his 30 years of sacrifice, the entire war effort, it was all a shell game, a massive internal cover-up built on physics ignored and people exiled. He grabbed the auxiliary mic, his hand shaking, connecting to the wounded Admiral. "Tyrus, what do you know about the Ethel Covenant?" Static crackled, followed by Tyrus's ragged breath. Gibberish, mechanic. Focus. I'm pinned down. The thing is tearing through the junction. The north tunnel is too slow. Answer me, Lysander insisted, his voice low, demanding. Did the Confederacy exile a faction 50 years ago? Did they study relativistic time debt? Tyrus's response was a sharp, pain-filled gasp, followed by a strained, chilling laugh. You think this is about aliens, Lysander? Of course it was us. Always. The Ethel didn't just understand the debt, they quantified it. They became the interest rate. Now move, you idiot. I can hear it breathing. The Admiral confirmed it. The entire war was a self-inflicted internal catastrophe. Lysander's objective changed instantly, saving the fleet tactically, allowing Tyrus to broadcast the alien invasion lie, would only perpetuate the political debt and guarantee the eventual collapse of the Confederacy when the rest of the Ethel fleet arrived. But exposing the truth via Tyrus's encrypted comms would shatter the entire structure of the core worlds, causing immediate, widespread societal panic and civil war. Lysander looked at the fiber optic readout. The Thresher was now less than 60 seconds from engagement range of the stationary fleet. He was trapped between two impossible moral anchors. Option A. Help Tyrus broadcast the lie. The 30,000 souls of the fleet might survive the Thresher, reposition and escape the K7 system, but they would continue to fight a ghost war for a corrupt, unsustainable power structure. Lysander saves his life, perhaps even gets Tyrus's promised amnesty, but becomes the ultimate collaborator, condemning future generations to pay the temporal debt. Option B. Force Tyrus to expose the Covenant as the truth, that the war is a debt collection. This destabilizes the system immediately, alerting the core worlds to the decades-long cover-up, potentially halting the war and saving future sacrifices. But the immediate, inevitable consequence would be the instantaneous execution of Lysander for treason and the near-certain destruction of the stationary fleet, which would be left paralyzed and leaderless, vulnerable to the massive harvest vessel. Lysander swallowed, the metallic taste of copper and spatial distortion thick on his tongue. He had spent 30 years running from the lie of his duty, trying to justify the subjective years he had stolen from his family. He had already chosen treason once to protect the fleet's immediate survival. Now, he faced the choice of treason to protect their ultimate freedom. He looked at his grime-covered hands, the perpetual black stains on his skin. He was a mechanic. His job was to fix fundamental failures. The tactical situation, saving the 30,000, was transient. The political and moral failure was systemic. If I choose the lie, I die the coward I always feared I was, he thought. If I choose the truth, I die a traitor, but the debt is exposed. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the complex clicking of the harvest entity speeding up above him. The sound was no longer hunting, it was closing for the kill. Tyrus was seconds from being caught. Lysander had to act. Tyrus, Lysander said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, the choice made. I'm sending you the full Level 5 schematics now. Access the maintenance shuttle dock. Lock yourself in and power up the main comms array immediately. I need the encrypted access codes now. I cannot help you further without them. You get the schematics, I get the codes, mechanic. Protocol, Tyrus snarled, clearly terrified but still clinging to the formality of command. Lysander ignored the man's insistence on power. The Thresher is in range, Admiral. 30 seconds until engagement. If you are processed, those codes are lost. The 30,000 die. Give me the primary comms encryption key immediately. Verbal relay. The silence on the comms line stretched, broken only by Tyrus's frantic, labored breathing and the sickening sound of metal tearing. The creature had breached the last junction. It's on me, Lysander, Tyrus screamed. It's on me. The codes, Lysander roared. In a voice raw with terror, Tyrus finally spat out the long, complex string of encryption sequences. Lysander's mind, disciplined by decades of engineering, logged every number and identifier instantly. Now, the schematics, Tyrus gasped. Lysander's fingers flew over the keyboard, but he didn't send the schematics for the safest route. He rerouted the feed, showing Tyrus the final narrow access shaft leading to the shuttle dock. A structural bottleneck he knew the massive Harvest entity would be unable to pass without initiating a full, powerful spacetime warp, essentially bottlenecking the creature. Tyrus would reach level 5, but the creature would be forced to wait, or tear the walls down around him. "You have the path," Lysander confirmed, the lie cold on his tongue. "Go." Tyrus cut the connection. Lysander had the keys. He scrambled to install the codes into the auxiliary panel, bypassing the station's main comms lock completely. He had full, unrestricted access to the fleet's internal channels, a direct line to every bridge and tactical screen. But as the access key finalized, Tyrus's frantic transmission buffer flooded Lysander's screen with a final, unauthorized data packet, dumped in the moment of extreme duress. It wasn't a tactical note. It was a decades-old personnel file, flagged, Priority 1, Confidential. Lysander felt the blood drain from his face as he read the file header. Admiral Tyrus. Primary contractor. Initial deployment of relativistic jumps. K7 system. Objective time, 55 years ago. Tyrus wasn't just an ignorant admiral chasing a lie. He was one of the architects of the lie. He was one of the few men who knew the true scope of the temporal debt before the war even began. Lysander had just helped the very system he hated gain sanctuary, just as the realization settled. A horrific liquid crunch echoed from the vertical shaft Tyrus had taken, followed by absolute silence on the comms line. Tyrus was gone. Lysander stared at the final line of Tyrus's personnel file, the ultimate piece of hidden truth. A single name listed under Initial Strategic Oversight. The name wasn't Tyrus. It was the name of the core world senator who had pushed through the initial, high-speed relativistic expansion bill. It was a political failure, not a military one. Lysander had traded the life of a necessary accomplice for the codes, only to discover the man he sacrificed was deeper in the conspiracy than he ever imagined. The cost was immediate and brutal. He now held the full truth of the political corruption in his hands, but he was pinned in the dark, cold sublevel, the Thresher entity engaging the stationary fleet just 30 seconds away, and his moral choice, exposure over survival, was now exponentially more dangerous. He looked at the open comms channel, the massive fleet waiting for a command. He knew what he had to do. He typed the single, damning message onto the primary tactical screen override, preparing to broadcast the full truth of the Ethel Covenant and the 50-year lie. He knew the Confederacy would execute him for destabilization, but he finally had the antidote to the systemic failure. But just as his finger hovered over the broadcast key, the emergency power line sputtering beside him died completely. The darkness was absolute, and a new sound began, emanating from the vertical shaft where Tyrus had fallen. A small, faint clink. The Harvest entity was not running after the Admiral. It had been using Tyrus to herd Lysander directly into this position, knowing it was the only stable data access point left. Lysander hadn't trapped the creature. He had delivered himself to the collectors, and the power failure was deliberate. The Harvest wanted him alive but isolated. It needed the mechanic, not the code. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country, or planet, are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The cost of Lysander's political choice arrived instantly, wrapped in absolute suffocating darkness. The power failure was precise, surgical. It was not a chaotic system collapse, but an intentional act of isolation. Lysander slumped against the frozen bulkhead, the encryption codes he had bought with Tyrus's life now useless on a dead panel. The open channel to the fleet, the damning truth of the Ethel Covenant, all of it paralyzed, a silent scream trapped in static. The small, faint clink from the vertical shaft where Tyrus had fallen was the only sound now. It was measured, heavy, and chillingly deliberate. The creature was inside the sublevel, moving with a patience that defied every rule of conventional warfare. It was not a brute. It was a collector. Lysander forced his eyes to adjust to the void. He lifted his grimy, trembling hands to the auxiliary comms panel, feeling the cold, dead plastic. He sought the small independent battery access, a secondary failsafe he had installed months ago for unexpected brownouts. He fumbled for the access screw, his fingers slick with sweat and the faint residue of cryogenic gas. Clink. Closer. The sound echoed off the metal walls, disorienting him in the pitch black. He found the panel, but the screws didn't turn. They felt fused, almost liquid. He realized what had happened. The creature had anticipated his need for backup power. It hadn't merely shut down the mains. It had used a localized burst of warp energy, a non-conventional heat source, to weld shut every remaining access point capable of feeding energy to the comm system. The Harvest entity was not just intelligent, it was preemptive. It had studied his failure in the comms deck and adapted. Lysander pressed his face against the cold metal, drawing a ragged breath. The metallic taste of copper and dread was overwhelming. He had been outmaneuvered not by an enemy, but by an algorithm of debt collection. The silence that followed the final weld was worse than the clinking. The Harvest entity had stopped moving. It was waiting, confirming its dominance. Lysander dropped his head, exhaustion pulling him toward a desperate final surrender. He was defeated, not by force, but by the scale of the deception. He had condemned Tyrus, the architect of the lie, only to discover the lie was structural, reaching back 55 objective years to the core world senator. His singular, heroic act of exposure had been rendered mute, while the political rot he sought to destroy remained untouchable. He saw his life flash, not as a coherent sequence, but as a series of accumulating failures. The young mechanic who promised his daughter a swift return, the soldier who fled his duty to protect his secret, the traitor who exposed a lie only to be trapped by a deeper truth. He wasn't a hero trying to save the fleet. He was a desperate ghost trying to justify 30 wasted years. It doesn't matter. The thought echoed in the emptiness of the sublevel. It was always futile. The Thresher was engaging the fleet now. Lysander knew it. He didn't need a screen to confirm the physics. The massive gravitational field of the second entity, warping space-time to pierce the fleet's concentrated mass, would already be creating tidal stress across the entire K7 well. 30,000 lives were dying because he delayed for 30 seconds, trying to decide which form of treason was more moral. He had nothing left. No light, no power, no comms, no allies, no hope. Just the cold metal and the invisible creature waiting for him to move. Why try? The silence demanded an answer. Why not just wait for the end? Lysander pushed the memory of his daughter away. He couldn't use her image anymore. It was too raw, too painful, too rooted in the subjective illusion he had chased. He focused instead on the cold, indifferent beauty of physics. The Ethel Covenant had simply obeyed the Ouroboros symbol. They let time turn on itself. And he, Lysander, had been their final, useful piece of collateral. He needed to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a mechanic whose machine had broken. He forced himself to think past the paralyzing fear. He reviewed the structural layout, feeling the metal framework around him. Every system was dead except for one, the cryogenic coolant system he had manually ruptured earlier. The main lines were sealed, but the emergency pressure valve remained open, venting gas into the sublevel until the pressure equalized. He dragged his hand along the wall, seeking the source of the persistent cold. His fingers brushed against the ruptured conduit, now coated in a thick layer of ice. The residual hydrogen-3 was inert, harmless, but the fracture had occurred directly beside the highly specialized grav sensor array power box. Lysander had overloaded that sensor, forcing the power spike that provided the final data burst in Part 2. He realized the implication. When he overloaded the grav sensor, the system's primary power was fried, but the array itself had a highly sensitive, internal capacitor bank designed to maintain calibration data during power fluctuation, a bank entirely isolated from the main grid. It was an arcane engineering redundancy built to protect data integrity, not human life. If the Harvest entity had used localized heat to weld the comms panel, It meant it was relying on Lysander's lack of mobility in the dark. It believed it had control, but the entity, being technologically focused, likely dismissed the unstable cryogenic lines as mere noise and residual danger. Lysander forced himself to move, inching along the frozen floor toward the grav sensor housing. The cold bit through his thin jumpsuit. The box was metallic, complex, and encased in ice. He needed to activate the capacitor. He couldn't send a signal. The antenna array was fried. But the data retention unit was still functional, running on its tiny, self-contained charge. It held the truth, the Ethel Covenant designation, the Senator's file, and the encrypted codes. He found the access port for manual discharge, a tiny, recessed copper pin designed to dump the stored data into a tethered diagnostic unit. Lysander didn't have a diagnostic unit and he didn't have power to broadcast, but he had the ruptured coolant line. Lysander looked at the frozen metal. He needed a massive, short-duration electrical burst, a final, violent surge that could breach the isolation field of the Thresher's main gravitational anchor, currently holding the entire fleet in place. He needed to send not a data packet, but a physical shockwave. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only tool he had left, a small, specialized torque wrench, cold and heavy in his hand, a piece of honest metal from his mechanic days. He calculated the risk. The data retention unit ran on a charge so small, connecting it directly to the volatile cryogenic line would cause a massive thermal disparity, resulting in a flash explosion. It would vaporize the residual hydrogen-3, creating a high-energy electromagnetic pulse, an analog discharge that would overload the microcapacitor, pushing its stored data onto the only conductor available, the station's structural housing. The cost was immediate and absolute. The EMP would destroy the grav sensor, kill any chance of further communication, and almost certainly kill Lysander with the explosive force at such close range. He had only a fraction of a second to connect the copper pin to the frozen line. This is not a choice for survival, he realized, the cold clarity washing over the debris of his earlier breakdown. This is a choice for maximum damage. He looked into the absolute darkness, focusing on the coordinates of the Thresher's gravitational anchor, which he knew by heart. If the pulse was timed perfectly, it might disrupt the Thresher's focus, forcing it to momentarily release its hold on the stationary fleet. The fleet wouldn't escape, but they would have a chaotic, maybe 3-second window to attempt a tactical high-G scatter jump. It was impossible, insane, but it was physics. Lysander raised the heavy wrench. He positioned the copper pin against the frozen conduit. He had one chance. Before he could strike, a low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the deck plates. It was not the high-frequency click of the harvest entity. This was a deep, guttural sound, like a tectonic plate grinding. The creature had stopped waiting. It was actively engaging the surrounding structure, creating a localized pressure field designed to crush the sublevel. It had realized Lysander was stationary, not paralyzed. In the brief moment the pressure field intensified, Lysander saw a faint, bioluminescent shimmer appear directly behind the grav sensor box. A massive jointed appendage, phased slightly out of density, preparing to stabilize itself and seize him. The creature was using the moment of structural stress to finally grab its prey. Lysander knew he was seconds from being collected. He had to fire the pulse now. But just as he slammed the torque wrench down, his thumb brushed against a faint, almost invisible scratch on the grav sensor housing. An ancient burn mark, not from him, but from the station's original construction decades ago, and he recognized the mark. It wasn't standard Confederacy identification. It was the Ethel Covenant's secondary marker for resource collection points. The harvest entity wasn't trying to capture him at the station's only remaining data link. It was trying to capture him at the collection point. The creature wasn't just collecting biomass or data, it was taking possession of the station itself, fulfilling the final term of the 50-year debt. Lysander didn't stop the hammer. He adjusted his aim by millimeters, striking the copper pin with brutal force, not aiming to send the data out to the fleet but to overload the collection point itself. If the Crucible station was the collateral, destroying it might buy the fleet more time than a single failed broadcast. The discharge was instant and catastrophic. A brilliant, blinding flash of electric blue light erupted, followed by the soundless, physical impact of the EMP. Lysander felt a searing heat across his skin, followed by a sudden, total vacuum of cold, as the entire remaining atmosphere of the sublevel was flash frozen. He was thrown backwards into the darkness, his last coherent thought the agonizing realization that the burst had worked. The resonance hum stopped instantly. The harvest entity had lost its anchor, but the explosion had not killed him. Instead, the sudden, extreme cold of the cryogenic flash freeze had shocked the harvest entity's phased appendage, forcing it to momentarily retreat, pulling the massive, non-conventional density out of the sublevel. Lysander lay gasping on the floor, barely alive, the sublevel now absolutely silent and frigid. He was alone, having just sacrificed his life for a 3-second window of tactical confusion for the fleet, a choice that might still be futile. But then, across the frozen bulkhead, a new phenomenon appeared. The EMP had charged the structural metal of the crucible station itself, and where the explosion had occurred, tiny flecks of residual data, forced out by the violence of the discharge, began to crawl across the frozen metal in thin, shimmering lines of blue light. It was the entire encrypted data set, the truth, the codes, the 50-year debt, written onto the hull itself, frozen in a volatile, rapidly fading phosphorescence. He could not broadcast it. He could not read it all. But he saw one line of data, the Ethel's final command sequence, resolve clearly on the freezing wall. It wasn't a military order. It was a structural analysis. Crucible station, primary function, mobile comms relay. Lysander understood the final, terrible truth. The station was designed to jump, not the fleet. The crucible itself was the forgotten critical element of the Confederacy's expansion. If he could still access the manual controls of the drive core, if the harvest hadn't disabled that too, he might not save the fleet, but he could take the station, and the truth written on its walls, with him. He had one last, impossible chance to steal the collateral. The glowing data, frozen onto the bulkhead in thin lines of blue light, was not just information. It was the physics of injustice made visible. The lines resolved into structural schematics Lysander hadn't seen in 3 decades. They weren't blueprints for a comms relay, but for a high-G relativistic transport. The Crucible was not a station. It was a stealth jump ship, disguised as a fixed relay, a last-ditch contingency designed to flee the system and carry the essential political infrastructure in case of total strategic failure. It was the ultimate concealed betrayal. The Confederacy never intended to fight until the end. They intended to run. Lysander lay still, letting the cold seep into his bones, allowing his mind to trace the shortest path to the drive core manual override. The blast had momentarily stunned the harvest entity, but the respite wouldn't last. The creature was designed to recover rapidly from non-conventional energy fields, adapting its density oscillation. He tried to stand. His legs responded, but his hands, those instruments of precision that had once fixed engines running at 80% light speed, betrayed him. They were shaking violently, permanently damaged by the EMP. The frost covering the deck plates was slick, his movements clumsy, a 55-year-old man moving like a newborn calf on ice. He moved toward the nearest access ladder, guided only by the phosphorescent glow of the data on the wall. He ignored the pain. He focused on the cold, hard logic of the Ethel Covenant's debt collection, which was still visible in the data streams. Crucible Station, final collateralization. If the station was the payment, then the Ethel Covenant and the massive thresher needed it intact, or at least anchored. Lysander reached the ladder, scrambling up towards level 2 where the secondary maintenance access to the drive core lay. He ascended maybe 4 meters when the rhythmic low hum began again, closer this time, resonating through the metal rungs. The harvest was recovering, and it wasn't pursuing. It was flanking. It had learned the topology of the sublevels and was positioning itself between Lysander and his objective. Lysander threw himself onto the level 2 deck plate, landing hard. He saw the shimmering in the darkness 40 feet ahead, a localized distortion field, the creature coalescing its density, reforming its appendages. The metallic taste in the air spiked, a dizzying wave of spatial nausea. He had no time for stealth. He needed speed, and he needed a distraction. He spotted the emergency flare dispenser, a standard safety feature, now obsolete. He ripped the panel off, exposing 3 large chemical flares. He pulled the pins. He threw the first flare away from the drive core access, towards the gravity well perimeter. It ignited instantly, casting a blinding, magnesium-white light onto the metallic collector. The harvest entity paused, momentarily blinded by the conventional light, its intricate jointed frame momentarily visible, a structure built of interwoven dark matter composite, terrifyingly real. Lysander used the 2 seconds of distraction to reach the drive core access hatch. His damaged hands fumbled with the manual lock override. The fine motor control was gone. He gritted his teeth, forcing his trembling fingers to lock onto the heavy steel wheel, relying on muscle memory and sheer brute force. The harvest entity adjusted. It didn't chase the flare. It calculated Lysander's movement and the physical barrier between them. It began to hum louder, focusing the localized pressure field. Lysander felt the deck plate beneath his boots begin to buckle inwards, the metal protesting the unnatural stress. The collateral is non-negotiable. A synthesized voice cut through the hum, raw static layered with cold, inhuman precision. It wasn't Tyrus's comms. The entity was communicating directly through the station's structural resonance. Compliance is required, Mechanic Lysander. Your life is accounted for. Do not tamper with the asset. Lysander didn't respond. He slammed the second flare into the access wheel, using the wooden shaft as leverage, forcing the lock to turn with a screech of tortured metal. The harvest entity was speaking to him, confirming the terrifying logic of the ethel. He was a numbered element in their calculation of the total debt. Your action is inefficient, the resonance stated, now closer, the distortion field causing the air to crackle. The stationary fleet is secured by the thresher. Any jump attempt will be negated by the established gravitational anchor. The hatch broke open. Lysander tumbled into the narrow high-voltage access corridor leading to the core, ignoring the flash of pain in his wrenched shoulder. He gripped the third flare, his last distraction. The drive core controls were agonizingly analog, covered in heavy, insulated dials and levers, perfect for absorbing the constant micro-vibrations of a jump drive, impossible for a man with failing hands. He found the manual relativistic jump initiator, a heavy 6-inch lever secured by a complex magnetic lock. He needed to enter the coordinates, disengage the inertial dampers, and pull the lever. But the harvest entity was right behind him, its massive bulk already attempting to phase through the narrow corridor. The air grew heavy, thick with distortion. Lysander knew he couldn't enter the complex coordinates necessary for an accurate jump. His hands would fail. He made a devastating choice, the ultimate failure of a mechanic. He would force a blind jump. He grabbed the emergency coordinate bypass switch, a rusted tertiary circuit rarely touched, and flipped it. The system defaulted to a randomized high-G jump vector. Anywhere but here. He heard the heavy, sickening thud as the harvest entity's primary appendage fully materialized inside the corridor, tearing through the metal shielding. The creature was prepared to physically collect him, tearing him out of the drive access. You will not breach the debt, the resonance insisted, amplified by the confined space. Lysander looked at the shimmering blue light crawling across the outer shielding of the drive core. The truth was written there. He had to make the evidence visible. He realized that the EMP had destabilized the station's passive energy field. If he pulled the jump lever, before disengaging the inertial dampers, the resulting energy spike, the literal physics tearing the ship apart, would broadcast the phosphorescent data as a massive short-range informational burst. It would destroy the station, but the truth would reach the stationary fleet seconds before the thresher could start processing. This was the final total sacrifice, trading the chance of escape for the certainty of exposure. The harvest appendage lunged, its sharp, jointed tip aimed directly at Lysander's chest. Lysander roared, a sound of 30 years of suppressed guilt and rage, and slammed the heavy torque wrench against the magnetic lock holding the jump lever. The impact shattered the lock. He didn't wait. He grabbed the lever with both hands, ignoring the searing pain of his damaged nerves, protesting the exertion. The harvest appendage stabbed forward. Lysander was a fraction of a second too slow. The tip of the appendage, moving with non-conventional density, pierced the thick synth fiber of his jumpsuit and the soft tissue of his left shoulder. The pain was a silent, crushing white heat, but it was not the pain of penetration. It was the pain of collection. He felt a cold, subtle drawing sensation, a pull of biomass, as the entity began its parasitic sampling. Despite the agony, Lysander yanked the jump lever down with his remaining strength. The ship didn't jump smoothly. The gravitational containment field surrounding the core shrieked in protest, fighting the simultaneous jump charge and the engaged inertial dampers. A violet-white energy surge tore through the corridor. The air pressurized violently, and Lysander tasted ozone, burned flux, and his own blood. The localized gravitational distortion was immense, a chaotic, localized space-time event. The harvest entity, anchored to Lysander's biomass, screamed in resonant static as the violent power feedback hit its complex density field. The creature was ripped backward, its stabilized phase dissolving into noise. The power surge was too violent, too uncontrolled, even for its adaptive technology. Lysander was thrown against the bulkhead, his left arm useless, his vision tunneling. As the station's core ripped itself from the local system, the structural housing groaned a final terrible sound. And then, silence. The jump was instantaneous and brutal. When Lysander's senses returned, the darkness was still pervasive, but the terrifying hum of the harvest entity was gone. He lay amidst sparking, melting circuitry. The cold had returned, but his entire left side felt numb, collected. He tried to look for the phosphorescent data on the wall, the evidence he had sought to transmit. It was gone. The catastrophic jump feedback had vaporized the external charge. The truth was no longer written on the walls. He had sacrificed his survival for a broadcast that failed, using a method that destroyed the evidence. Then, a faint, rhythmic ping registered in the emergency atmosphere sensors. The ship was intact, the jump successful, but the power failure remained. The sensors were running on residual thermal energy from the core. He dragged himself to the nearest observation port. The view was absolute, infinite blackness save for a single distant, blinding cluster of stars. The core worlds. He had jumped the crucible 30 objective years in the opposite direction, toward the heart of the Confederacy. The fleet was safe, for now. He had given them the chaotic 3-second window they needed to scatter or initiate their own jumps. But he hadn't destroyed the Thresher's anchor. He had simply stolen its final piece of collateral, forcing the Ethel Covenant to waste critical energy recalculating its debt collection strategy. He listened to the faint, residual atmospheric ping. It was the sound of objective time returning to the mechanic. He was 62 now, objectively. The price of his choice was absolute isolation, permanent neural damage, and a burden of truth he had failed to transmit. Lysander finally managed to sit up, leaning against the cold, dead core controls. He looked down at his trembling hands, the tools of his trade now useless. He closed his eyes, accepting the final failure. He was no hero. He was just a mechanic who had chosen the most destructive, desperate, and impractical solution, simply because it was the only one that addressed the systemic lie. He had saved no one cleanly. He had merely replaced 30 years of objective time debt with an immediate debt of total chaos. The quiet, internal comms unit, running on the same thermal residue as the atmosphere ping, crackled softly. It was a single, delayed signal. The fleet, moments before he initiated the blind jump, had recognized the catastrophic gravitational field collapse he caused. They had scattered. A message, automated and cold, was broadcast across the emergency frequencies to the entire sector, designating the Crucible station as system contamination source, self-inflicted treason. He had won nothing but condemnation and silence. He was a fugitive, hurtling toward the core worlds with the truth held only in his ruined mind. The cold acceptance settled over him. Moran had been right. He had chosen the sacrifice, but he had lost the control. The difference between them was that Lysander was now permanently marked by the consequence. He looked at his shaking hands and knew he needed to learn to live. Alone, with the tremors and the truth, for however long his radiation exposure allowed. The war was over for him. The repair work was about to begin. The air was different now. Not the metallic burnt flux of the crucible station, but the cold, sterilized synthetic scent of the crucible transport. The forced jump had purged the immediate contaminants, but replaced them with the dull, pervasive isolation of deep space travel. Lysander spent the first subjective week dragging himself to the environmental controls, powering minimal life support. His left shoulder was a scar, a cold, dense absence where the harvest entity had performed its parasitic sampling. The tremors in his hands were worse, a chronic reminder of the EMP discharge. He was no longer a mechanic. He was a liability, permanently flawed, fleeing through the dark. He monitored the emergency transmission logs. The fleet was gone. They had used his chaotic 3-second window to initiate randomized jumps, saving themselves tactically, but strategically fractured. The price of their salvation was the designation the Confederacy had branded him with. System contamination source, self-inflicted treason. He had exposed the systemic lie by becoming the system's designated failure. The 30,000 souls were safe, scattered, but they owed their lives to a traitor. The irony was a cold comfort, the bitter taste of a victory that felt exactly like total loss. He had sacrificed his integrity to save the victims of the system, only to be classified by that system as its ultimate pathogen. Lysander was a man of cold, objective time now. He was 62. Every wasted minute of the war etched into the persistent neurological failure of his hands. He no longer attempted to stabilize the drive core's erratic power fluctuations. He let the system's run degraded. The core worlds were his destination, but not for amnesty or rescue. He was a delivery man carrying the stolen collateral, the fully intact, stealth transport crucible, and the burden of truth contained only in his memory. He remembered the promise he had made his daughter 5 subjective years ago. 30 objective years passed. I'll be back soon. He realized now that the promise was built on the same systemic lie that manufactured the harvest entity. His pursuit of subjective duty had cost him everything objective. He sat in the Admiral's chair on the now silent bridge, the rank insignia glowing faintly from ambient light. He looked at his shaking, useless hands. He felt no remorse for Tyrus. The architect of the lie had paid the first installment of the debt. Lysander's own payment was his permanent incapacity. He refused the solace of guilt. Guilt was the luxury of the ignorant. He held only responsibility, the heavy, cold weight of 30 years of compounded error. He had not chosen to be a hero. He had chosen to be the mechanic who finally admitted the machine was fundamentally broken. He had traded salvation for chaos, recognizing that the only way to stop the unsustainable pursuit of the lie was to shatter the vehicle carrying it. The Confederacy would face the truth in 2 stages. First, the unexplained, massive gravitational collapse that saved their fleet. Second, the arrival of the crucible at their doorstep, carrying the fugitive mechanic and the physical evidence that the war was a political fraud engineered by the men they trusted most. The journey continued, silent and cold. Lysander often stood by the observation port, watching the core worlds grow from a smear of light into a terrifying, complex web of civilization, the thing he had sacrificed 30 years to protect, the thing built upon a foundation of physics ignored and time stolen. He understood the cold calculus now. The choice was never between good and evil, but between 2 forms of inevitable consequence. He had chosen the chaos of the truth over the stagnation of the lie. The systemic collapse would come, fueled by the exposure he carried, but at least it would be an honest end, not a prolonged, rotting one. He did not seek forgiveness. Forgiveness was granted by those who understood. The core world, steeped in the relativistic illusion, would see only treason. He would be processed, executed, or contained. But the core worlds would receive the stealth ship, the tangible proof of their pending debt, delivered by the mechanic who refused to die for their convenient fiction. His task was complete. The 30 years were finally justified, not by saving his past, but by demanding a future of accountability. Lysander knew the precise coordinates of his forced arrival. He had set the ship on a course for the deepest security perimeter of the core worlds, ensuring his capture would be immediate and, crucially, unavoidable. He would not run again. Running was how the lie persisted. He stood up, walking toward the observation port one last time. He touched the cold viewport with his ruined hand, feeling the permanent tremor travel through the glass. He had failed to transmit the truth, but he had succeeded in delivering himself, the final undeniable piece of evidence. The logic of the harvest entity was proven correct. All debts must eventually be collected, regardless of the cost to the collateral. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold metal of the core controls. The quiet ping of the atmosphere sensor was the only sound now, a gentle mechanical rhythm. The entire Confederacy, chasing an obsolete memory across decades of space, had been operating under an illusion of control. Admiral Tyrus had stepped onto the deck plates with unwarranted confidence, certain he controlled the data, certain he controlled the time. Lysander had taken that control away, piece by painful piece. He had stopped the war, not with a victory, but with a devastating diagnosis. The repair work was over. The consequence was all that remained. He had nothing left to whisper. The silence, finally, was absolute. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science.